Hey everyone, What If Fan here, bringing you another exciting part of What If Transmigrated in Bleach World. You can find the fanfic title and the original author's name on my Patreon page. Make sure to check it out and show them some love. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Also check out my Patreon channel for early releases of all the series, where you can find all the series released one day ahead of YouTube. Alright, let's jump into it. Chapter 231. Respira embodied malevolence, insidiousness, and absolute terror in its purest form. Any entity unfortunate enough to contact it would experience the equivalent of several millennia of temporal acceleration compressed into mere moments of subjective experience. Under the relentless assault of this inexorable temporal current, all physical matter would inevitably degrade to microscopic particles, and all spiritual entities would disintegrate into fundamental nothingness. What rendered this ability particularly horrifying was its propagation mechanism, which operated similar to a highly aggressive toxin. Even minimal contact would trigger immediate spread throughout the victim's entire physical or spiritual structure. Consequently, even the slightest exposure to Respira typically resulted in total annihilation, with no known countermeasure or method of neutralization. Even the 99th level binding path keto techniques proved incapable of resisting time's fundamental erosion. It represented a fundamentally unstoppable force that could not be physically touched, blocked, or sealed through conventional means. Evasion remained the only viable response. Therefore, when Uehara Shiroha's blade made contact with the temporal field, all observers anticipated not only the immediate disintegration of his weapon but also the subsequent contamination of his spiritual form with the aging effect, resulting in catastrophic structural failure. Lieutenant Matsumoto Ranjaku, positioned in proximity to the massive sword, directed her ash-based Zanpakuto, Hiniko, to hover protectively around Uehara Shiroha, hoping to provide some form of tactical assistance should the opportunity arise. During previous combat engagements, she had witnessed firsthand the terrifying application of Baragon's temporal manipulation abilities. Her concern, however, proved entirely unnecessary. Uehara Shiroha's precisely executed/effortlessly dispersed the incoming temporal acceleration field. Those universally feared manifestations of accelerated aging failed to generate even the most minimal disturbance pattern and were completely nullified by his seemingly simple attack. The most astonishing aspect of this counteraction was the complete absence of any visible supplementary Ryatsu coating the ice blade during its execution. Conventional combat wisdom maintained that the only theoretical method to counteract Baragon's temporal field required the expenditure of truly astronomical quantities of spiritual pressure in direct opposition. Furthermore, the Ryatsu deployed would necessarily require overwhelming quantitative and qualitative advantages to successfully suppress Baragon's Respira technique. No alternative countermeasure was believed possible within established spiritual combat principles. Yet Uehara Shiroha had fundamentally violated this supposedly immutable rule. His ice-based weapon had not released any detectable surge of supplementary spiritual pressure during the encounter. Nevertheless, impossibly, he had employed what appeared to be a conventional ice blade to completely negate Baragon's supposedly invincible temporal acceleration field. How can this be possible? Baragon, now fully transformed into his skeletal manifestation, conveyed an expression of absolute shock despite his lack of conventional facial structures. My Respira corrodes all existence without exception. It represents the inevitable final destination of all things. Even concentrated Ryatsu and specialized spiritual techniques cannot escape the fundamental fate of temporal degradation and structural dissolution. How have you successfully resisted its effects? Why does your weapon remain unaffected by temporal acceleration? Does this represent your Zanpakuto-S Shirkai or Bankai manifestation? Or does it share fundamental properties with Kyokusu Uegetsu? Is this merely an elaborate sensory illusion? In his fully released form, Baragon existed as a skeletal entity adorned with a black ceremonial robe and ornate crown, wielding a massive double-edged ceremonial axe. His entire physical structure had transformed into bleached white bone, devoid of any soft tissue. With no remaining dermal layer on his facial structure, presenting merely a bare cranial formation reminiscent of the legendary Lich King, it should have been physiologically impossible for him to convey emotional states. Yet somehow, his skeletal features effectively communicated an expression of absolute astonishment. His profound shock was entirely unavoidable given the circumstances. This development transcended the boundaries of his conceptual framework. Throughout his extraordinarily extended existence, his Respira technique had never encountered such complete and effortless neutralization. This outcome registered as fundamentally incomprehensible, absolutely contradicting established spiritual principles. The temporal acceleration field represented Barragan's primary instrument of dominance throughout Hueco Mundo, the foundational source of his unquestioned authority spanning tens of thousands of years. In reality, even Barragan himself lacked complete immunity to Respira's fundamental effects. In the original historical timeline, Barragan had ultimately perished through exposure to his own temporal acceleration power. Because this ability represented such a fundamentally unsolvable tactical problem, redirecting it against its wielder constituted the only viable method of achieving his defeat. During that confrontation, the former Keto Corps commander Hachigen had deployed various high-level Keto techniques to establish multiple barrier layers surrounding Barragan, while Captain Suefon's Jakuho Reikaben Bankai had delivered repeated devastating impacts. Yet against Barragan's temporal acceleration field, every technique had disintegrated to microscopic particles and demonstrated complete ineffectiveness. Whether employed offensively or defensively, Respira appeared to possess no exploitable vulnerabilities. This ability seemingly defied all conventional countermeasures, with no established checks or balancing factors. Ultimately, Hachigen had been forced to sacrifice his arm as a tactical necessity. He employed specialized spatial manipulation Keto to teleport the limb already contaminated with temporal acceleration effects directly into Barragan's holocenter. The master Keto practitioner had discovered that even Barragan himself lacked comprehensive immunity to his own temporal manipulation powers. Consequently, Barragan, the self-proclaimed king of aging, had perished through accelerated aging of his own fundamental structure. Before his ultimate dissolution, he had hurled his ceremonial axe toward Aizen in a final gesture of defiance, but Aizen had simply disregarded it, representing a rather inglorious conclusion. The situation perfectly embodied the ancient proverb, "The combatant was defeated, but the technique remained fundamentally unvanquished." Barragan had fallen, but the power of temporal acceleration itself had never been successfully countered or overcome. Ultimately, Respira had claimed the definitive victory through its own fundamental principles. This historical outcome further demonstrated the truly terrifying nature of the temporal acceleration field and its status as a fundamentally unsolvable tactical problem. For such an unparalleled ability, Barragan had naturally placed absolute confidence in its effectiveness. Yet today, Uehara Shiroa had employed a single sword stroke to completely shatter the supposedly invincible fundamental principle of the temporal acceleration field. This development truly transcended conventional understanding. Consequently, Barragan experienced momentary cognitive paralysis, his consciousness unable to properly process the implications of what had just transpired before him. Stark and Harabel shared equally profound shock and bewilderment at witnessing this unprecedented development. They had not anticipated that Barragan's universally feared Respira would demonstrate such complete ineffectiveness, so easily neutralized by Uehara Shiroa's casual intervention. Barragan had secured his position as Segunda Espada precisely because of the seemingly unsolvable tactical problem presented by his temporal acceleration abilities. Without Respira's effectiveness, Barragan resembled a predator deprived of its primary natural weapons, his threat assessment value dramatically diminished. The central enigma that none of them could successfully resolve was the fundamental method through which Uehara Shiroa had accomplished the seemingly impossible feat of temporal neutralization. Chapter 232. It was definitely not simple Reiatsu suppression, but it didn't appear to be conventional ability restraint either. The confusion etched itself deeply across the features of both Stark and Harabel as they struggled to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Could it truly be an illusion, something akin to Aizen's perfect hypnosis? The possibilities cascaded through their minds, each scenario more unsettling than the last. Lilinette, who had transformed into a spear spirit, expressed her shock with characteristic bluntness. "This old man is completely useless. He has 2 opportunities to strike. Nothing but worthless trash." Her harsh assessment hung in the air, crude yet undeniably accurate regarding their current predicament. Baragan, the self-proclaimed king of Hueco Mundo, had been rendered effectively impotent against a single opponent. The Segunda Espada's most formidable ability had been neutralized with the casual ease of brushing away an insignificant cobweb. Weakness is not necessarily an obstacle to survival, but ignorance invariably leads to destruction. Uehara Shiroha declared, his voice maintaining perfect calm yet resonating with unmistakable authority. His combat momentum unfolded with the unstoppable force of a hurricane, his terrifying Ryatsu transforming into a brilliant sword beam that soared majestically into the sky. The radiant energy carved through the atmosphere with surgical precision before piercing directly through Baragan's skeletal form. The attack left a trail of crystalline particles suspended in its wake, shimmering like diamonds against the battlefield's backdrop. The vaunted power of aging and the self-styled Lord of Time now appeared as nothing more than childish pretensions before him. Baragan's authority, constructed over millennia of unchallenged dominance throughout Hueco Mundo, crumbled with the pathetic ease of sandcastles before an incoming tide. In the face of Shunkyo, who had transcended the fundamental forces of time and space themselves, any spacetime ability, regardless of how formidable it might appear to lesser entities, was revealed as merely a pale imitation, a delusional approximation of true cosmic authority. He was the authentic sovereign of temporal and spatial domains, not this hollow skeleton adorned with a meaningless crown. Furthermore, Baragan's aging power represented merely the surface manifestation. Just the barest suggestion of the true power governing time and space. It didn't even approach genuine manipulation of the authentic principles that governed reality's temporal fabric. Therefore, Uehara Shiroha's Ryatsu could effortlessly crush the breath of aging into worthless slag, like a celestial body obliterating a mere meteor through sheer gravitational dominance. Of course, the current Ryatsu capacity of this clone remained limited, rendering it impossible to exert the full magnificent potential of Shunkyo. The original body's capabilities dwarfed what this ice construct could manifest in combat. If it had been an ordinary Zanpakuto, the ice clone would not have possessed its power whatsoever. But for Uehara Shiroha, who commanded the unlimited blade works, the unity between wielder and sword was as fundamental as breathing. A basic operation requiring no conscious thought or deliberate effort. Now Shunkyo, having surpassed the limitations of even the most powerful Shinigami, had completely merged with his essential nature. The sword was not merely an external tool but an extension of his very being, a physical manifestation of his will transformed into adamantine purpose. So naturally, his Ryatsu carried within it the fundamental power of time and space. Uehara Shiroha needed only to stimulate this innate ability to produce all manner of extraordinary effects. Ignoring the invasion of the aging aura was as inconsequential as disregarding a gentle drizzle on a sweltering summer day, barely worth acknowledging, let alone concerning himself with. Over there, facing Uehara Shiroha's devastating slash, Baragan, whose cognitive processes seemed momentarily scrambled like an overheated computational device, failed to react with appropriate immediacy. The skeletal Espada remained caught in a destructive cycle of disbelief and denial, his ancient pride unable to process the reality unfolding before him. When he finally regained his full faculties, Baragan discovered it was already far too late to evade the incoming attack. His instinctive response was to summon his aura of aging as a defensive measure, but the vivid memory of its complete ineffectiveness flashed through his consciousness like a warning klaxon. This momentary hesitation and uncertainty effectively sealed his fate. With this fatal delay in response time, Baragan was struck with devastating force. The ancient hollow was nearly torn asunder by Uehara Shiroha's attack, which had been delivered with such casual indifference that it bordered on insulting. It was genuinely fortunate that Uehara Shiroha hadn't truly exerted his full strength in this particular strike. Combined with the fact that Baragan's defensive capabilities were not inconsiderable after releasing his Resurrección, the Segunda Espada managed to survive what would have constituted a killing blow for virtually any other opponent. Had Uehara Shiroha attacked with genuine intent to destroy, Baragan would have been reduced to microscopic particles scattered upon the wind. Witnessing this shocking scene unfold, Harabelle felt her heart sink with the leaden weight of inevitability. The brief exchange had provided irrefutable proof that Uehara Shiroha could not be defeated in one-on-one combat under any circumstances. Their only remaining chance lay in coordinated attacks from multiple angles, leveraging their numerical advantage to its fullest extent. Therefore, Barragan must not be allowed to fall so quickly. If he were eliminated from the battlefield equation, they would inevitably be defeated one by one, methodically picked off like ripened fruits from a vulnerable tree. With this urgent tactical realization, Harabel did not hesitate for even a fraction of a moment. She seized the brief opening when Uehara Shiroa had just completed his sword strike against Barragan to launch a perfectly timed surprise attack of her own. She transformed into a stream of brilliant light, her movements fluid and graceful despite the desperate circumstances. In an instant, she had positioned herself directly above Uehara Shiroa, her fin-shaped blade raised high overhead. With a fierce battle cry that reflected her determination, she brought the weapon down in a devastating arc. Simultaneously with her primary strike, thousands of water streams materialized around her, each one transforming into fine, densely packed blades of liquid that slashed toward Uehara Shiroa from every conceivable angle. The attack was both aesthetically magnificent and lethally efficient, a shimmering cage of water designed to trap and slice her opponent to ribbons. Uehara Shiroa had anticipated this counteroffensive, of course. The tactical move was entirely obvious to someone possessing his experience and perceptual acuity. He raised his ice sword without altering his expression, blocking the onslaught with casual ease. The powerful impact force from his parry dispersed the water blades instantly, sending droplets scattering in all directions like crystal beads, while the cold edge of his weapon intercepted Harabel's white sword with a metallic ring that echoed across the battlefield. Even before hostilities had commenced, he had thoroughly understood that facing a single opponent was fundamentally different from confronting three simultaneously. Fighting three top-tier powerhouses concurrently would naturally increase the pressure exponentially. If it had been Aizen occupying this position, victory would have been virtually impossible without immediate recourse to Kyoka Suigetsu's perfect hypnosis. The former captain would have had no alternative but to rely on his Zanpakuto's unique abilities to even the overwhelming odds. In a one-on-one scenario, Uehara Shiroa could crush any opponent without significant risk, dispatching them with effortless grace and precision. But in a 3-against-1 situation, theoretically, certain vulnerabilities would become unavoidable. The fundamental tactical problem was elegantly simple. Whenever he moved to attack one opponent, the other two would inevitably seize that opportunity to launch their own coordinated strikes. Being attacked from front and back simultaneously created a perilous situation, but facing coordinated assaults from three directions established a condition of extreme tactical danger. This was precisely why the strategy of three dogs killing a lion had been so widely recognized throughout history as fundamentally effective. Even the mightiest predator could be brought down when surrounded and harried relentlessly from multiple angles. Of course, if Uehara Shiroa had been fighting with his original body rather than this clone, the numerical difference would have been utterly meaningless. He could simply have employed his overwhelming strength to crush them all simultaneously. But the current ice clone, with its inherently limited Ryatsu reserves, required a more measured tactical approach. This ice clone possessed an impressive arsenal of abilities, ranging from the power of stands to overwhelming observation haki and even aspects of the infinite gems. But utilizing these abilities as primary offensive tools would be somewhat impractical and wasteful. They were optimally suited as auxiliary techniques or for instantly dispatching ordinary captains and vice-captains. To defeat 3,000-year-old captain-level powerhouses in a 3-on-1 confrontation, Uehara Shiroa needed to conserve his Ryatsu with maximum efficiency and minimize unnecessary expenditure. Therefore, he currently relied primarily on his most foundational abilities, his transcendent swordsmanship, unparalleled speed, and peerless tactical acumen. In truth, as long as he could utilize these fundamental skills to their ultimate potential, victory remained absolutely assured. The qualitative difference was simply too vast to overcome with mere numerical superiority. "I cannot permit your success." Stark reacted with impressive speed, raising both guns and firing a devastating barrage of concentrated energy at Uehara Shiroa. Although attacking in this manner might appear somewhat dishonorable, he admitted with characteristic frankness, "Your combat capabilities simply exceed conventional parameters. I cannot afford to squander such a tactically advantageous opportunity." This represented the entire strategic purpose of outnumbering an opponent. Creating situations where effective defense became temporarily impossible, forcing them to divide their attention with potentially fatal consequences. At this critical juncture, Uehara Shiroa had just completed his sword motion to block Haribel's primary attack, and Stark's Infinite Zero followed immediately afterward, denying him any opportunity to breathe or recover his optimal stance. If it had been any other captain-class combatant facing this perfectly coordinated assault, they would have been overwhelmed instantly, their defenses shattered and their existence threatened. But for Uehara Shiroa, even Stark's formidable Infinite Zero could be neutralized with basic Ryatsu defensive techniques. The only reason he preferred not to rely on such methods was the limited Ryatsu available to his clone. He remained reluctant to waste precious energy on pure defensive maneuvers when it could be more efficiently utilized elsewhere. Therefore, Uehara Shiroa launched into an expertly executed Shuunpa, his figure blurring into complete invisibility before reappearing safely in the air, having completely evaded the attack without apparent effort. "I had theorized that speed might constitute your primary weakness," Stark observed with palpable disappointment evident in his tone, "but it appears you are not merely powerful, you're comprehensively balanced across all combat domains." This man was truly formidable, apparently without discernible weakness or vulnerability. The tactical opportunity Stark had just exploited would have successfully trapped even the notoriously elusive Kayaraka Shunsui. Yet Uehara Shiroa had evaded with such apparent ease that it almost seemed as if he were merely enjoying himself throughout the exchange. Chapter 233. But Uehara Shiroa was able to dodge it with effortless grace, his movements so fluid that he appeared almost completely relaxed in the face of their coordinated assault. There was no discernible tension in his posture, no strain evident in his expression, just the calm, unshakable confidence of a genuine master at play. Uehara Shiroa flashed through the air like an ethereal phantom, materializing behind Stark with his sword already in motion. "I should be accurately classified as an all-round combatant," he remarked with casual indifference as his blade descended, "but speed does indeed represent my most significant tactical advantage." Ordinary Shuunpa, ordinary slash, or so these techniques might appear to untrained observers. But these seemingly basic maneuvers, performed with such transcendent skill, left the top espadas utterly helpless before him. These were warriors who had terrorized Hueco Mundo for centuries, Arrancar who had earned their elite positions among Aizen's forces through countless victorious battles, yet they now found themselves dodging desperately, their dignity and composure in tatters. Over there, Haribel finally processed the tactical reality of their situation and rushed to support Stark, her movements urgent and determined. The realization had dawned upon her with crystalline clarity that Barrigan was proving entirely unreliable in this particular confrontation, leaving only herself and Stark to carry the primary burden of combat. She swung her massive blade with practiced precision, channeling a tremendous surge of concentrated Ryatsu through the weapon. The resulting attack was genuinely spectacular, sharp sword light intertwined with massive waves of water, blasting outward with the devastating force of artillery fire. The brilliant sword energy and the cascading layers of water covered vast portions of the sky, creating a continuous barrage of overwhelming destructive power. This represented her strongest offensive combination, an attack sequence that had never previously failed to at least wound an opponent of captain class. Under normal combat circumstances, even a highly skilled captain-level Shinigami would be forced to retreat immediately or suffer potentially lethal injury. But this supposedly guaranteed attack missed its target entirely. The figure of Uehara Shiroa simply vanished from the perceptual field of both Haribel and Stark, disappearing so completely that it seemed as if he had never occupied that spatial position at all. Such extraordinary speed! The two Espada exclaimed in unison, their sensory abilities working at maximum capacity as they strained to locate Uehara Shiroa's Ryatsu signature. Every nerve ending in their physical forms engaged in the desperate effort to track their extraordinarily elusive opponent. However, they quickly discovered that Uehara Shiroa's intended target wasn't either of them, it was Barrigan. The skeletal Espada, who had barely recovered from the previous devastating assault, found himself knocked away once again by Uehara Shiroa's blade before he could even assume a proper defensive stance. Barrigan roared with unbridled fury and indignation, activating his aura of aging with mounting frustration. "I am Barrigan Lusenbairn, the undisputed king of Hueco Mundo." His voice echoed across the battlefield, thick with wounded pride and escalating rage. This damned Shinigami was treating him like a soft persimmon, a weak target to be repeatedly humiliated. The situation had become utterly intolerable. As the sovereign who commanded the awesome power of aging, when had he ever suffered such profound humiliation? If he weren't disadvantaged by the very fundamental nature of his power, which embodied the concept of age itself, he would certainly administer an appropriate lesson in respect to this presumptuous youth. Was this not simply a case of bullying the elderly? The profound irony of his current situation was not lost on the ancient Hollow, whose very power represented the inexorable erosion of time. In the midst of these thoughts, Uehara Shirowa's figure flashed past once again, effortlessly evading the continuous attacks from all three Espada with astonishing speed and impeccable timing. His every movement was precisely calculated, each step measured to the millimeter, each turn executed with flawless grace. His movements embodied a perfect synthesis of elegance and lethality, combining artistic beauty with deadly purpose. Every gesture was perfectly measured and controlled, allowing him to navigate the confined combat space with remarkable agility. His fighting style integrated offensive and defensive elements seamlessly, balancing firmness and flexibility, hardness and softness with masterful precision. Stark, Barragan, and Harabel were growing increasingly numb to the humiliation of their tactical situation. Three acknowledged masters supposedly besieging a single opponent, yet he was making them appear as novices stumbling helplessly after a grandmaster. They fought with desperate intensity and unwavering commitment, while he seemed to be merely swimming gracefully around them, treating this life-or-death confrontation as little more than an entertaining exercise in combat aesthetics. One individual making sport of the three of them, this level of disrespect transcended anything they had experienced in all their long existences. Their pride as Espada, as the elite of Aizen's formidable army, was being systematically dismantled with each passing moment. The three strongest Espada attacked with mounting ferocity and ruthlessness, withdrawing all restraint and holding nothing in reserve. Each employed their most specialized and devastating techniques, every strike aimed with unambiguous lethal intent, each movement executed with all the spiritual power they could possibly muster. Their combined Ryatsu surged like a raging tempest, imposing and genuinely awe-inspiring to behold from any distance. But despite their most determined efforts, they made negligible progress against their singular opponent. Uehara Shirowa's fundamental combat foundation was simply too robust, his level of mastery too far beyond their comprehension. Throughout the entire confrontation, he relied solely on basic abilities, primarily his transcendent mastery of Zenjutsu, yet remained effectively invincible against their combined might. For Uehara Shirowa, this battle was providing genuine entertainment value. High-quality combat engagements of this nature were relatively rare and intrinsically interesting, especially when facing multiple skilled opponents simultaneously. Perhaps in future encounters, he might showcase more of his specialized techniques. There existed a certain aesthetic fatigue that inevitably accompanied consistently overwhelming opponents through raw power alone. The world of the Shinigami rarely witnessed fancy swordsmanship of the kind commonly found in mortal martial arts schools. Such elaborate techniques were largely rendered useless in spiritual combat, where the fundamental deciding factor remained the quality and quantity of Ryatsu. The battles between Shinigami were, at their essential core, contests of spiritual power. What mortal combatants might classify as skill represented merely compensation for insufficient intrinsic strength and speed. Ultimately, it was the human body's inherent structural limitations that necessitated the historical development of technique. And even then, bound by the physical laws of the universe and the anatomical constraints of human physiology, there existed hard limits to what skill alone could possibly accomplish against overwhelming power. When confronted with absolute speed and overwhelming force, all the technique in existence became fundamentally meaningless. One force can defeat 10 skills and one sword breaks all established laws were not mere philosophical sayings but fundamental truths of combat reality. Therefore, absolute power and speed reigned supreme in spiritual combat. Ryatsu, the raw spiritual energy that flowed through Shinigami and hollows alike, was the great equalizer that made this principle immutable. Flashy sword techniques, regardless of how visually impressive they might appear to observers, lacked genuine practical value in high-level combat scenarios. No matter how dragon-like or elaborately fancy these movements might be, everything ultimately reduced to the fundamental elements of speed, power, and Ryatsu quality. Without significant advantages in these foundational areas, attempting to rely on tactical tricks and visual showmanship would invariably result in decisive defeat and potentially fatal injury. Therefore, skill served merely as decorative ornamentation, while absolute strength formed the unshakable foundation of authentic combat prowess. This philosophy was perfectly embodied by Uehara Shirowa's distinctive fighting style. This fundamental principle explained why he could effectively toy with three formidable opponents simultaneously, and why he didn't even bother employing the simplest and most efficient swordsmanship techniques. Instead, he deliberately chose to utilize gorgeous, performative movements that showcased his absolute mastery over the fundamental building blocks of combat. He moved with truly dragon-like grace across the battlefield, his sword becoming a natural extension of this draconic imagery. Agile and elegant like the mythical beast of legend, his blade danced through the air with frightening precision and lethal intent. An ordinary ice sword transformed completely in his hands, becoming a flying harbinger of winter's embrace, a frost dragon soaring majestically through the heavens, looking down upon the world below with imperial disdain, freezing everything in its path with casual indifference. The sword wind howled with fearsome intensity, the sword light gleamed with lethal sharpness, resembling a celestial dragon traversing the sky with imperial majesty, trailing awesome power in its magnificent wake. His absolute speed and overwhelming strength allowed Uehara Shirowa to engage any of the three Espada at will, suppressing them completely before moving effortlessly to the next target. Whenever the others attempted to provide tactical support to their embattled comrade, he had already transformed into the dragon metaphor made manifest and vanished completely from their desperate reach. It appeared on the surface to be 3 against 1, but in practical reality, he had been fighting a series of 1-against-1 encounters, dictating the terms of engagement entirely according to his own strategic preference. The seemingly ordinary ice blade in his hands found critical vulnerabilities with every single strike, each hit targeting vital points with unerring accuracy. His attacks lacked the ostentatious ferocity of the Arrancar's techniques, but contained within them immense power and concentrated murderous intent. Had he not been deliberately conserving his strength to maintain his decisive speed advantage, the three Espada would have been comprehensively defeated long ago, their physical forms broken and their pride shattered beyond any possibility of repair. With a single sword, Uehara Shirowa effectively suppressed 3 of the most powerful Espada in Aizen's formidable army. His presence and spiritual pressure were more imposing than the combined might of all 3 Arrancar, a testament to the overwhelming qualitative difference in their respective power levels. Chapter 234. Stark couldn't help but voice his growing frustration, a touch of disbelief coloring his normally laconic tone. Is it really us who are besieging him, rather than him besieging us? Why do I feel like he is everywhere at once? The question hung in the air, rhetorical yet painfully accurate. What had begun as a 3-on-1 advantage had twisted into something that felt suspiciously like being hunted by a predator who was simply toying with his prey before delivering the killing blow. As Arrancar, and particularly as Arrancar who had released their Resurrection, their Ryatsu far exceeded that of ordinary Shinigami captains. By all conventional metrics, they should have possessed overwhelming spiritual power in this confrontation. Based on their sensory perception, Uehara Shirowa's Ryatsu wasn't so monumentally strong that it should be able to crush them without effort. In terms of raw quantity of spiritual energy, they might even possess a marginal advantage when their powers were combined. Yet despite this theoretical edge, they simply couldn't overcome their opponent. The fundamental problem wasn't the amount of Ryatsu, but its quality. In this crucial aspect, they found themselves utterly outclassed, thoroughly and completely defeated. The opponent's Ryatsu existed on an entirely different plane from their own, as if they inhabited separate dimensions of reality. It wasn't merely stronger, it was fundamentally different in nature, composed of spiritual energy that operated according to principles beyond their understanding. Stark, whose personal Ryatsu was remarkable even among the Espada for its volume and seemingly infinite reserves, had a particularly deep appreciation for this troubling reality. His entire existence had been defined by his overwhelming spiritual pressure, yet here he found himself outmatched in a way he couldn't fully comprehend. Judging purely from the exploration of his spiritual sensing abilities, Uehara Shirowa's Ryatsu appeared decidedly average, unremarkable, even. Much like his fighting style, which employed basic techniques rather than flashy specialized abilities. But these seemingly ordinary abilities were somehow suppressing 3 top-level Espadas simultaneously. Stark couldn't accept that there wasn't some form of absolute Reiatsu supporting such capabilities. The evidence of his senses contradicted the evidence of the battle itself. The only explanation that made sense was that they simply lacked the perceptual capacity to detect the true nature and magnitude of their opponent's power. They were like primitive creatures trying to comprehend advanced technology. The gap in understanding was simply too vast. This realization explained why they had been able to maintain a slight advantage at the beginning of the confrontation, relying on numerical superiority to compensate for individual weakness. But as the battle progressed and the trump cards of all three Espada were systematically cheated out of them one by one, they found themselves increasingly on the defensive despite their numerical advantage. Injuries began to accumulate, minor at first but growing increasingly serious with each exchange. What a heavy sword! It's obviously just an ice blade, Harabel thought with a mixture of awe and dismay. A cold light suddenly flashed before her eyes, and she hastily raised her blade to intercept the incoming attack. Majestic Reiatsu and violent water flows erupted from her weapon, barely managing to block Uehara Shiroa's slash at the critical moment when it would have cleaved through her defenses entirely. She had gradually adapted to this pattern of attack over the course of the battle and could now respond more promptly and effectively than when they had begun. But this adaptation came with a price, a collection of small but distinct cuts marking her bone armor like plum blossoms etched into the white surface. Each time their Reiatsu collided directly, Harabel suffered minor but cumulative damage. Over time, these small injuries were beginning to coalesce into more serious wounds, slowing her movements and weakening her responses. The absurdity of their situation wasn't lost on her. Despite outnumbering their opponent 3-1, they were the ones accumulating injuries while their enemy remained completely unscathed. It was as if they were fighting a force of nature rather than a single combatant. The primary reason for this one-sided exchange was Uehara Shiroa's overwhelming speed. Compared to Ishuinpa, their sonido might as well have been the plodding movement of a turtle. The gap wasn't merely significant, it was insurmountable. True to form, before Harabel could mount any kind of meaningful counterattack, Uehara Shiroa's figure had already vanished from her sight. He had simply flashed away, retreating 100 meters in an instant before launching yet another devastating attack from an unexpected angle. Uehara Shiroa's surprise attacks were ethereal and utterly unpredictable. He moved with the speed of lightning, maintaining an elegant composure even as he delivered strikes of lethal intent. Each attack concealed deadly purpose beneath its graceful execution. The most frustrating aspect was that their opponent hadn't even resorted to using his Zanpakuto's special abilities. With nothing more than his extraordinary speed, Uehara Shiroa had stretched all three Espada to their limits, leaving each of them bearing wounds of varying severity. The three Arrancar had reluctantly grown accustomed to Shiroa's impossibly fast attack and defense rhythm, and similarly accustomed to the feeling of powerlessness that accompanied each failed attempt to land a meaningful blow. In truth, compared to Shiroa, the movements of all three Espada appeared sluggish and ponderous. This stark contrast created the illusion that the three top Espadas were unremarkable in their abilities, leading an observer to potentially conclude that 1 versus 3 Espadas is manageable, even Kensei could handle it. The reality, of course, was nothing like this misleading impression. 6 captains of Kensei's caliber would struggle mightily against these opponents, and even 100 would likely fall before their combined might. It was Shiroa's exceptional speed that made the 3 elite Espadas appear slow by comparison. Their movements weren't lacking by any objective standard, they were simply being judged against an impossible benchmark. Any individual captain from the Gotii 13 would find themselves overwhelmed facing even one of these Espada in their released forms, let alone all 3 simultaneously. For a prolonged period, the 3 Espada found themselves trapped in a cycle of reactivity, constantly on the defensive and unable to seize the initiative. Barrigan's situation was particularly miserable among the 3. On one hand, his vaunted Respira, the aging aura that had been his signature ability for millennia, was completely ineffective against Uehara Shiroa. On the other hand, his opponent seemed to have taken a particular dislike to him, pursuing him relentlessly across the battlefield with neither respect nor mercy. For Barrigan, who had ruled Hueco Mundo as its undisputed king for longer than most souls had existed, this battle had ceased to be a contest of strength or a test of skill. It had degenerated into an extremely painful form of torture, a systematic dismantling of his pride and identity. As the former absolute monarch of Hueco Mundo, Barragan had little experience with enduring hardship of any kind. He had always been the one inflicting suffering rather than receiving it. It was precisely this aversion to personal discomfort that had led him to eventually surrender to Aizen, completely shattering his reputation as the indomitable ruler of Hollow's pride had ultimately bowed before pragmatism. Initially, he had approached this battle with confidence, anticipating a favorable outcome where he could employ his aging aura to teach Uehara Shiroha a lesson in humility and respect. He had envisioned a satisfying conclusion where the upstart Shinigami would crumble to dust before his power, like countless others before him. But now, such thoughts had completely abandoned him, replaced by a desperate desire for escape. He had to admit, if only to himself, that he was old. The elderly should be permitted to rest, to recline comfortably and let younger warriors bear the brunt of such violent confrontations. This was decidedly not the battle he had wanted or expected. But the choice was no longer his to make. Uehara Shiroha had not forgotten Barragan's earlier provocations, his boastful claims of supremacy and contemptuous attitude. The Shinigami had decided to give him special attention as a result, focusing his attacks on the ancient hollow with particular intensity. Consequently, Barragan found himself unable to escape even when his every instinct screamed for retreat. Trapped on the battlefield by circumstances beyond his control, he discovered that flight was impossible. Faced with the absolute speed of his enemy, he felt like a damned soul in a bottomless, inescapable hell. Able only to struggle futilely against his inevitable fate. Barragan's inner voice screamed in protest, "No! No! No! This is not the battle I want. This is not my war." His fighting spirit began to crumble under the relentless pressure, his technique deteriorating as he shifted to purely defensive maneuvers. Every thought became focused on finding some avenue of escape, some way to remove himself from this nightmarish situation. Stark and Harabel observed with grim understanding as their comrades' resolve visibly weakened, recognizing the signs of someone preparing to abandon the battlefield. They had fought alongside Barragan long enough to read his intentions clearly. With tacit agreement, neither spoken nor directly acknowledged, the two remaining Espada maneuvered to block Barragan's potential escape routes. Their movements were subtle but deliberate, forcing their fellow Arrancar to remain in position and continue bearing the most ferocious attacks from Uehara Shiroha. It was a cold but calculated decision. If someone had to serve as the primary target for their opponent's relentless assault, better it be the one who had boasted the loudest and contributed the least. Better Barragan than themselves. In the harsh mathematics of survival, sacrifices were sometimes necessary. And if Barragan had to serve as that sacrifice to improve their collective chances, then so be it. The former king would be forced to earn his keep, whether he wished to or not. As the battle continued to unfold across the skies of fake Karakura town, the spectators below watched with a mixture of awe and terror. The clash of such immense spiritual powers created shockwaves that rippled through the atmosphere, distorting the very air around them. For those with spiritual awareness, the conflict resembled a deadly dance between titans, beautiful in its terrible power, frightening in its implications. And at the center of it all was Uehara Shiroha, moving with impossible grace and striking with devastating precision, single-handedly holding three of Aizen's most powerful warriors at bay. It was a display of skill and power that defied conventional understanding of the hierarchies of strength in their world. A demonstration that would be remembered long after the battle's conclusion, regardless of its eventual outcome. Chapter 235. It's not that Stark and Harabel wanted to sell out their teammate. Betrayal was never their intention. The cold reality was that Barragan had lost his motivation and now only wished to be a cowardly lizard, escaping from the battlefield rather than standing his ground. Since there had never been any true possibility of unity among them from the beginning. Each serving Aizen for their own reasons rather than out of genuine loyalty or camaraderie, it seemed more pragmatic to make the most of Barragan's predicament. This way, even a liability could serve some purpose. They couldn't win this battle in its current configuration anyway, and with no internal cohesion, their defeat was merely a matter of time. In the harsh calculus of survival, sacrifices sometimes became necessary, and Barragan, with his wounded pride and deteriorating resolve, had become the most expendable. Why doesn't my power of aging have any effect on you? Barragan, the former king of Hueco Mundo, raged helplessly as he found himself trapped in a situation with no viable escape. Even when his aging field was not yet in its released state, it could have a measurable effect on captain-level Shinigami, significantly slowing their movements and reactions. His killing techniques like Respira became exponentially more potent after releasing his Resurrection, earning him the fearsome reputation where anyone who stands in the way will be killed. But when facing Uehara Shiroa, both the passive aging field and the active Respira proved completely ineffective, as if they were merely gentle breezes blowing against a mountain. This was beyond incredible, it defied everything Barragan thought he understood about his own powers. He was profoundly puzzled by this inexplicable immunity, his confusion manifesting as impotent rage. His crown, once the symbol of his absolute authority, now seemed like a mockery atop his skeletal head. Stark shared these same doubts, his brow furrowing in contemplation as he continued to engage in the uneven battle. I was also wondering the same thing, he admitted, firing another barrage of Siros that Uehara Shiroha effortlessly avoided. Why do you seem to be immune to our techniques? Logically, the Ryatsu you're expending should not grant such overwhelming superiority. What makes you different? By all reasonable expectations, his infinite Siro should be devastatingly effective against close combat fighters like Uehara Shiroha. The technique had successfully suppressed Kayaraka's Shunsui earlier in their confrontation. If not for the timely intervention of the white-haired captain, Stark believed he could have forced Kayaraka to reveal his Bankai. Yet these same techniques that had pressured a captain of Kayaraka's caliber were completely ineffective against Uehara Shiroha. It violated every principle of combat that Stark had come to understand throughout his long existence. Harabel, fighting with unwavering determination despite the increasingly hopeless situation, also frowned in perplexity. She harbored numerous questions that remained unanswered. Why hadn't Uehara Shiroha utilized his Zanpakuto's special abilities? How was he able to dominate 3 espadas simultaneously without even releasing his sword or calling upon his Zanpakuto's powers? The sensation of being thoroughly controlled by an enemy throughout a battle was deeply unsettling, alien to one accustomed to being among the most powerful beings in Hueco Mundo. It filled her with a disquieting combination of shock and confusion, challenging everything she thought she knew about the hierarchy of power. It's because of the different levels, Uehara Shiroha explained calmly as he effortlessly parried the coordinated attacks of all 3 opponents. His movements remained fluid and precise, betraying no hint of exertion despite facing 3 of Aizen's most powerful warriors simultaneously. I've mentioned before that your understanding of Ryatsu was too superficial, he continued. Although you possess spiritual energy that exceeds that of ordinary captains, from my perspective, you actually comprehend nothing about the true nature of Ryatsu. The combat dynamics in the world of Bleach, he reflected silently, represented a complex interplay between raw power and specialized abilities. But this equilibrium only functioned on the fundamental assumption that combatants operated with incomparable tiers of spiritual energy. When one fighter completely overwhelmed another in terms of Ryatsu, no ability, regardless of its conceptual potency, could bridge that fundamental gap. This principle was perfectly illustrated when Aizen had incapacitated Grimjaw with nothing more than a glance, his overwhelming spiritual pressure rendering the Espada immobile. In other words, raw power established the baseline, determining the lower threshold of combat effectiveness, while specialized abilities could potentially raise the upper limit. The advantage of raw power lay in its stability, it rarely fluctuated significantly during battle. Abilities, by contrast, were highly dependent on compatibility, circumstances, and matchups. This explained why Kayaraka Shunsui, wielding only his Shurkai, had struggled somewhat against Stark in his released form. The Espada's infinite Siro created a powerful zone of denial that severely restricted the effectiveness of Kaiten Kayakatsu's abilities. After all, Kaiten Kayakatsu's various Shurkai techniques weren't directly lethal in nature, instead relying on their exceptional adaptability and flexibility to create advantageous situations. But ultimately, Kayarako still depended on landing actual sword strikes to secure victory. And the Infinite Siro's overwhelming suppressive capability had prevented exactly that, denying the captain any opportunity to close distance.
If Yuka Jushiro hadn't intervened at the critical moment, Kayaraka Shunsui might well have been pushed to his absolute limit.
During the Thousand-Year Blood War, Kayaraku's abilities had proven more compatible against X-axis Leal Baro, allowing him to achieve superior results. But in terms of overall combat potential, Leal was undoubtedly stronger than Stark, a testament to the importance of compatibility in spiritual combat. Other examples abounded. Wonder Weiss's ability to seal Ryujin Jaka was exceptionally potent against Yamamoto's fire-based Zanpakuto, but would be essentially useless against Hyarinmaru or other elementally dissimilar weapons. Against different opponents, Wonder Weiss was little more than a blank slate, his specialized adaptation rendered irrelevant. Therefore, the combat enhancement provided by specialized abilities was inherently unstable, varying dramatically based on matchups and environmental conditions. Even the surrounding environment could dramatically alter an ability's effectiveness. Hyarinmaru's ice-based powers, for instance, would be significantly handicapped in an arid environment lacking moisture. By contrast, raw spiritual power and the fundamental capabilities it enhanced, speed, strength, durability, and sensory acuity, remained consistently reliable factors in determining combat outcomes. These foundational aspects were stable, predictable, and absolute in their contribution to fighting prowess. This was precisely what allowed Uehara Shiroha to overcome the three Espada despite their numerical advantage and specialized abilities. He relied on the baseline capabilities provided by his superior spiritual energy to exceed even the maximum potential of his opponent's combined strength. This represented the most stable form of combat superiority, an upright, unbreakable advantage that transcended tricks and techniques. It was why he could confidently engage all three simultaneously, manipulating the flow of battle exactly as he pleased. Baragon found himself unconvinced by Uehara Shiroha's explanation, his skepticism fueled partly by genuine disbelief and partly by wounded pride. In truth, his defenses, both physical and psychological, had already been thoroughly breached. No matter what Uehara Shiroha said, Baragon was determined to oppose it on principle alone. His contrarian attitude stemmed not from reasoned disagreement but from the desperate need to maintain some semblance of his rapidly disintegrating dignity.
"You mean to tell me," Baragon snarled, anger radiating from his skeletal form, "that you can be immune to my Respira through the basic power of Ryatsu alone? Impossible. Absolutely impossible. Even Aizen himself cannot accomplish such a feat. Who do you think you are? A god?" The vehemence in his voice betrayed his desperation. All the Espada held absolute conviction in Aizen's overwhelming strength. It was the foundation upon which their loyalty, however reluctant, had been built. Chapter 236. Even Baragon was no exception to this rule of respect for Aizen's power. Despite his ancient pride and former status as king, he had been forced to acknowledge a superior force. If Aizen had relied solely on illusions generated by Kyokusu Uegetsu, he would never have been able to truly subjugate the unruly Espada. Hypnosis alone could not tame beings who had spent centuries or millennia as apex predators. Something more fundamental was required. Raw, overwhelming power that couldn't be denied or resisted. If Aizen's Ryatsu had been even slightly weaker than it was, Baragon would have launched an indiscriminate attack to destroy him, even if doing so meant burying a cadre of fellow Espada alongside his target. The former king would have deemed such collateral damage an acceptable price for eliminating the usurper who had stolen his throne. The reason Baragon had never attempted such a desperate gambit was startlingly simple. He couldn't succeed. Aizen's spiritual pressure was simply too immense. If the former Shinigami captain were to unleash his Ryatsu at full strength, he could withstand the aging aura through sheer spiritual dominance. Under such circumstances, Baragon's chances of victory were negligible at best. His power, though fearsome, had definite limits when confronted with truly superior spiritual energy. But even Aizen, with all his tremendous power, would need to expend an enormous quantity of Ryatsu to resist Respira's effects. It would require a significant portion of his spiritual reserves, representing a genuine effort rather than a casual dismissal. A situation like what they were witnessing now, where Uehara Shiroha seemed to completely ignore the power of aging through some inherent quality of his Ryatsu, should be utterly impossible. This transcended mere quantitative advantage. It suggested a qualitative difference that bordered on the metaphysical. Aizen, for all his strength, could never accomplish this. No Shinigami should be capable of it. No Arrancar, however powerful, could achieve such immunity. Only beings that existed beyond the conventional hierarchy of spiritual entities, gods, in the truest sense, should possess such transcendent capabilities. Baragon, who had once fancied himself a deity of sorts during his reign over Hueco Mundo, would never concede godhood to a mere Shinigami. His pride, though battered, would not allow for such humiliation. God? Stark's voice was thoughtful as he regarded Uehara Shiroa with complex emotions reflected in his gaze. Something in Uehara Shiroa's manner suggested that he wasn't simply boasting or attempting to intimidate them. Despite the outlandish nature of his claims, Stark sensed an underlying truth to his words. This man's Ryatsu might genuinely conceal divine power, or something functionally equivalent. It would explain how Uehara Shiroa could so effortlessly dominate three of Aizen's strongest warriors simultaneously. The fundamental reason had to be that his opponent's spiritual energy existed on an entirely different plane from their own. It wasn't merely stronger in the conventional sense. It operated according to different principles altogether. Whether examining raw Ryatsu itself or the various attributes it enhanced, speed, strength, defensive capability, and perceptual acuity, every aspect of Uehara Shiroa's power seemed to transcend normal limitations. The dynamic reminded Stark of ancient myths where gods looked down upon mortals from lofty heights. Uehara Shiroa's Ryatsu similarly gazed down upon them from a higher dimension of existence. Having spent centuries honing his spiritual senses as both predator and prey, Stark possessed a more intuitive understanding of Uehara Shiroa's unique energy signature than his companions. He had noticed something unusual about his opponent's Ryatsu from the very beginning of their confrontation, sensing subtle qualities that defied conventional classification. But he hadn't anticipated just how profound these differences would prove to be. This wasn't simply a matter of superior power within the same framework, this represented dimensional superiority, akin to the absolute control higher dimensional beings might exercise over lower dimensional existences. From their perspective, what they faced was indeed divine power, something that operated outside the rules that governed their reality. Harabel, too, found herself deep in contemplation. The gravity of the situation was becoming increasingly apparent as the battle progressed. She had also begun to recognize the vast chasm separating their capabilities from those of their opponent. This realization provoked unsettling questions about their fundamental nature and place in the cosmic hierarchy. Though her pride resisted such admission, the Shinigami before them possessed power so overwhelming that it inspired primitive awe, the kind reserved for natural disasters or celestial phenomena. His strength transcended conventional metrics, existing in a realm where their most devastating techniques became little more than gentle breezes. Could they truly overcome such an opponent? The question haunted her thoughts, seeding doubt where confidence had once reigned supreme. Baragon, it seems you remain unconvinced. Uehara Shiroa's form blurred as he initiated another lightning-fast pursuit of the skeletal espada. His actions continued to systematically humiliate the former king of Hueco Mundo, treating him as a soft persimmon that could be squeezed at will, the punching bag whose dignity meant nothing. The once mighty monarch had been reduced to little more than a plaything, a source of amusement for a being who existed beyond his comprehension. For Uehara Shiroa, this encounter represented an invigorating battle, a precious opportunity to refine his techniques through practical application, a stimulating game that tested his abilities in new and interesting ways. But for Baragon, the experience had degenerated into pure torture and humiliation. His advanced age had sapped his former zeal for combat. He longed only to reclaim his throne in Hueco Mundo, to rule in relative peace while waiting for the inevitable end that came to all things. The confidence that had once defined him had eroded over the millennia, replaced by caution and pragmatism. In truth, he had abandoned the warrior's path long ago, surrendering his fighting spirit to the very force he commanded, time's inexorable passage. This fundamental change had manifested when he rejected an invitation from the ancient Hollow Ica Mikodomo to invade Soul Society and assault the Soul King Palace. By declining that opportunity for greater power and glory, Baragon had effectively surrendered any possibility of evolving beyond his current state. Having sacrificed the courage to resist once, when facing Aizen,
it came as no surprise that he would lack the resolve to stand firm against Uehara Shiroa now.
The first compromise of pride made all subsequent surrenders easier to bear.
Stark and Harabel could only watch helplessly as Uehara Shiroa systematically dismantled the dignity and pride of the Espada who had once ruled all of Hueco Mundo. They felt the sting of humiliation by association, yet remained powerless to alter the course of events unfolding before them.
Stark recognized that their current approach was untenable.
If Barragan had maintained a stronger fighting spirit, they might have been able to adopt a war of attrition, accepting incremental damage while gradually depleting Uehara Shiroa's Ryatsu reserves and stamina. Such a strategy might have offered a slender ray of hope, however faint.
But with Barragan acting as deadweight rather than a genuine combatant, they couldn't even properly leverage their numerical advantage. To be brutally honest, their current disadvantageous position stemmed directly from Barragan's heroic performance or lack thereof. Uehara Shiroa had shrewdly targeted and surrounded Barragan with ferocious attacks, forcing Stark and Harabel to come to his aid. They couldn't abandon their fellow Espada without making their situation even more precarious. Consequently, despite ostensibly outnumbering their opponent, they found themselves pulled into a tactical quagmire, suppressed from every direction by a single adversary. Therefore, Stark abandoned hesitation and embraced desperate measures. With a surge of determination, he unleashed a tremendous burst of Ryatsu, causing the very fabric of his spiritual being to split and transform. This division manifested physically as a pack of wolves comprised of pure spiritual energy, each one an extension of his fragmented soul. "Let's go, Stark," he commanded, directing the spectral wolf pack to charge toward Uehara Shiroa with relentless ferocity. Although he harbored deep reluctance to risk Lilynette's spiritual integrity, she was, after all, the other half of his divided soul. The current trajectory of battle left him no alternative. If they continued engaging Uehara Shiroa as they had been, neither would survive the encounter. So, against his natural preferences, Stark committed fully to combat. Each wolf in the pack represented a fragment of his very essence, rendering them immune to conventional physical attacks. Upon contact with an enemy, they could explode with devastating force, tearing apart the target's spiritual structure from within. Such soul-based attacks were exceedingly difficult to defend against and inflicted particularly severe damage, equivalent to what gamers might call true damage. Harm that bypassed normal defensive capabilities entirely. Chapter 237. The wolf pack represented Stark's ultimate technique, equivalent to a second stage of his Resurrection, a final trump card reserved for only the most desperate situations. It was a powerful but risky maneuver, for the price of such overwhelming force was steep. If the wolf pack were to be destroyed, his soul would sustain corresponding damage. Each lost wolf diminished him in ways that transcended physical injury, striking at the very core of his being. Seizing the opportunity created by Stark's dramatic escalation, Harabel forced her injured body into motion. Despite the accumulated wounds that slowed her movements and sent waves of pain through her form, she summoned her Ryatsu to its maximum intensity. With fluid grace that belied her deteriorating condition, she soared skyward, her massive sword, Sane Queen, raised high above her head. The several shark gill patterns etched into the blade's surface suddenly activated, spraying forth streams of water that resembled luminous pearls in the afternoon light. In the blink of an eye, these modest streams expanded exponentially, transforming into a terrifying high-pressure water column of immense proportions. "Cascada," she cried, naming her most devastating technique as it erupted forth. The Cascada unleashed after releasing her Resurrection bore no resemblance to its unreleased counterpart. Where before she could generate only a focused stream of water, her released form produced a surging, majestic tidal wave, a veritable ocean compressed into a single devastating attack. Like a white rainbow piercing the sun, like the unstoppable advance of a tsunami, the technique completely engulfed Uehara Shiroa's figure, leaving no apparent avenue for escape. The water roared with the voice of an angry sea god, churning with enough force to pulverize stone and tear steel. Respira! Black flames erupted from Barragan's skeletal form as his Ryatsu exploded to its absolute maximum intensity. Even a clay figure still possesses some measure of pride when struck, how much more so for one who had reigned as the undisputed king of Hueco Mundo for millennia?
While Aizen had at least maintained a veneer of politeness when usurping his throne, this Uehara Shiroa treated him like a ball to be kicked around, a soft persimmon to be squeezed at whim, using him for entertainment, subjecting him to systematic torture disguised as combat. He loathed Aizen with the burning intensity of 1,000 suns, but his hatred for Uehara Shiroa had surpassed even that seething resentment, evolving into something primal and all-consuming.
It seems you still don't understand.
Facing the desperate, all-out attacks of the three Espada, Uehara Shiroa's expression remained as relaxed and composed as ever. There was no hint of concern in his features, no tension in his posture, only the calm certainty of absolute superiority. "Your abilities are indeed formidable," he acknowledged, his voice carrying easily over the cacophony of unleashed power surrounding him, "but they are ultimately meaningless when confronting someone like me.
First of all, it's speed." After this declaration, Uehara Shiroa's figure simply vanished from perception.
The time for games had passed. After toying with his opponents for his own amusement, he had decided to conclude matters decisively. The Ryatsu of his clone was approaching its operational limit, making this the perfect moment to demonstrate his true capabilities rather than the restrained fraction he had been utilizing thus far. This time, his Shuunpa velocity tripled compared to his previous movements. If Uehara Shiroa, with his transcendent mastery of movement techniques, genuinely intended to kill someone, even Aizen himself would struggle to evade the strike.
In a heartbeat less than the time required to blink, he had completely circumvented all three incoming attacks, rendering the Espada's ultimate techniques entirely futile. Then, Uehara Shiroa's voice resonated once more, then its power.
There was undeniable authority in his tone, a fundamental force that penetrated heart and mind alike, shocking the very soul of anyone who heard it. It wasn't merely volume or intensity that lent his voice such impact, but some intrinsic quality that commanded attention at the deepest level of consciousness. Stark, Barrigan, and Harabel felt a collective chill seize their hearts as primitive fear responses activated within them.
Ancient survival instincts, ingrained over countless centuries of evolution as hollows, screamed warnings of imminent destruction.
When they attempted to dodge, they discovered their bodies had become inexplicably leaden, refusing to respond to their desperate commands. Movement became impossible, as if they had suddenly been encased in invisible amber. With dawning horror, they realized that their spiritual perception and mental faculties had been momentarily paralyzed by the sheer pressure of Uehara Shiroa's unleashed Ryatsu. When the mind experiences such profound shock, the body inevitably suffers corresponding dysfunction, nervous systems freeze, muscles lock, and even involuntary processes falter briefly.
This momentary stagnation, lasting perhaps a fraction of a second, was all Uehara Shiroa required.
His sword was already in motion, cleaving through the air with impossible speed, and someone had been struck before the others could even process what was happening. Barrigan, with his heightened awareness of time's passage, experienced the moment in excruciating detail. He witnessed the approaching sword light, brilliant and boundless in its destructive potential, as it carved toward him with inexorable precision. It was a devastating blow beyond comprehension. A single strike whose aftershock alone could tear the fabric of reality asunder and rearrange the very heavens. The slash generated atmospheric disturbances visible as shock waves rippling outward from the point of impact, stirring wind and clouds in its wake.
With one perfect sword stroke, Uehara Shiroa negated everything the Espada had thrown against him. The wolf pack, water deluge, and death breath all dispersed like morning mist before the summer sun. Rendered not just ineffective but utterly inconsequential. The blade continued its perfect arc, piercing directly through Barrigan's skeletal form with surgical precision. Time itself seemed to pause in acknowledgement of the moment's significance, the fall of one who had once commanded time's power. "I cannot be reconciled."
Barrigan's voice emerged hollow and broken, still clutching his giant axe as his face contorted with a mixture of reluctance and absolute despair. He was the self-proclaimed king of Hueco Mundo, a great hollow who had existed for untold millennia, the sovereign ruler of all hollows beneath the eternal moon. How could such a being meet his end at the hands of a mere Shinigami? And not just defeat, but annihilation through a single strike. This conclusion to his long existence was fundamentally unacceptable, an affront to everything he believed about himself and his place in the cosmic hierarchy.
Barrigan could not, would not accept such a fate.
Every fiber of his being rejected this outcome, even as that very being began to disintegrate around him.
The massive axe in his grip shattered first, fragmenting into countless shards that dissolved into spiritual particles.
His skeletal body followed immediately after, crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to open flame, dissipating completely into erasure that scattered on ethereal winds. As a being who had built his identity around controlling the power of aging, who had dominated others through the very force that he himself feared most, there was a certain poetic justice in his being the first to fall. His avoidance of direct combat, his preference for intimidation over engagement, had ultimately left him vulnerable when faced with an opponent who could not be cowed.
When Stark witnessed Barrigan's death, a shocked exclamation escaped him. The implications were staggering. One of the three strongest Espada, eliminated with a single strike. He reacted with instinctive desperation, commanding his spirit wolves to converge and detonate, attempting to halt Uehara Shirowa's inexorable advance through sheer destructive force. Then the next step is defense. Uehara Shirowa announced calmly as he walked untouched through the explosive maelstrom that should have torn apart the soul of any captain-class Shinigami. Throughout the entire sequence, his expression never changed, his composure never faltered. He emerged from the conflagration as pristine as he had entered it, having treated the wolves' self-destructive attack with the same casual disregard one might show a gentle summer breeze. Witnessing this impossible scene, Stark experienced a moment of pure shock before his features softened into a resigned smile. "So you haven't been serious all along," he observed with bitter understanding. "It seems you could have easily annihilated us from the beginning. I didn't expect things would end this way." The words carried no accusation, merely acceptance of an unavoidable truth. Even as he spoke, Uehara Shirowa's figure had already vanished from his field of vision, moving faster than perception could follow. Stark, now deprived of his wolf pack and by extension, significant portions of his soul, no longer possessed any will to resist. In truth, his fighting spirit had always been tenuous at best, more a product of necessity than desire. Now, facing insurmountable odds, he surrendered completely to inevitability. As a solitary wolf who had wandered Hueco Mundo's endless wastes, Stark's story contained elements of genuine pathos. Among the endless monsters that populated the world of hollows, he stood out as a rare example of someone who retained genuine humanity despite his nature. His personality resonated with Uehara Shirowa's own sensibilities, and the bond he shared with Lilinet represented something authentic and precious in a world defined by predation and consumption. There was a certain tragedy in the necessity of his destruction. With this appreciation for his opponent's character, Uehara Shirowa channeled the last reserves of his clone's Ryatsu into his blade, determined to grant Stark a swift and dignified end rather than prolonged suffering. "Stark, you are actually a good person," he acknowledged with genuine respect, "but you still have to die." With those words of acknowledgement, Uehara Shirowa executed a final, perfect sword stroke. The accumulated spiritual pressure erupted forth like a tidal wave, engulfing Stark completely. The energy expanded outward in all directions, covering not just his opponent in the sky but also demolishing the tall buildings on the ground below. For a brief, terrible moment, all of Stark's defensive capabilities were utterly overwhelmed, swept away like leaves before a hurricane. The buildings below crumbled into rubble, while the remaining wolves in the air disintegrated into spiritual particles. The attack resembled nothing so much as a natural disaster, a meteorite streaking from heaven to earth, leaving only devastation in its wake. It was power in its purest, most elemental form, unconstrained by the limitations that bound lesser beings. Chapter 238. Feeling the sudden eruption of Ryatsu from Uehara Shirowa, all the Shinigami in Arrancar felt a chill in their hearts. The spiritual pressure rolled across the battlefield like a physical wave, pressing down on everyone present regardless of their allegiance. Even those at captain level found themselves momentarily breathless beneath the crushing weight of such concentrated power. Such Ryatsu was too strong, almost primordial in its intensity, as if some fundamental force of the universe had been harnessed and directed toward a single purpose. It resonated on frequencies that triggered instinctual fear responses in spiritual beings, causing even battle-hardened warriors to freeze in place. The slash formed by this Ryatsu would only be more terrifying. Energy of such magnitude, when focused into a cutting edge, could sever the very boundaries between dimensions.
Sure enough, a cold light flashed through the air, brief, brilliant, and beautiful in its deadly perfection. In that fraction of a second, Stark found himself pierced through the heart by Uehara Shiroa's blade, suffering a fatal injury that admitted no possibility of recovery. Uehara Shiroa was not like some of the strong figures in the world of Shinigami, those who transformed every battle into elaborate psychodramas, so much internal monologue and philosophical posturing that one might think they were composing poetry rather than fighting. Their battles were performances as much as conflicts, staged for invisible audiences. Although Uehara Shiroa was certainly proficient in countless refined pursuits, music, chess, calligraphy, painting, and countless other artistic endeavors, he maintained a clear separation between art and combat. Fighting was fighting, and there was no need for excessive mental gymnastics or emotional theatricality. He had always believed firmly in the principle that it was far better to inflict suffering on others than to torment oneself with needless complications. Mental consumption and excessive rumination during battle simply did not exist in his approach to combat. Why waste energy on internal conflict when it could be directed externally toward his opponent? Being a person who enjoyed tormenting others and testing himself against the strong, that was certainly part of his nature. The thrill of dominating powerful opponents, of demonstrating his superiority in the most direct manner possible, was an indulgence he permitted himself without hesitation. After all, he excelled in both the refined arts and martial prowess, fearing no challenger in either realm. In martial matters, he possessed the infinite Zanpakuto, and in literary pursuits, well, he still had the infinite Zanpakuto. His blade cut through both physical and intellectual challenges with equal efficiency. His philosophy was simple: let go of unnecessary personal restrictions and enjoy the fullness of existence. Abandon the tired narrative of self-sacrifice and helping others, and instead respect the natural unfolding of fate. Everyone had their own path to walk, their own destiny to fulfill or defy. Who was he to interfere with the cosmic balance? In Uehara Shiroa's considerable experience, when his sword remained sheathed and bloodless, the world became filled with irritating distractions, buzzing like flies around his consciousness. But once he drew his blade and let it taste blood, a remarkable quietude descended upon his surroundings. Problems had a way of solving themselves when confronted with decisive action rather than endless deliberation. No matter how touching or heartwarming other people's stories might be, he maintained emotional distance. Their narratives, however compelling, ultimately had nothing to do with him. He, Uehara Shiroa, operated beyond conventional sentimentality, transcending the petty constraints of ordinary moral frameworks. At the last moment of his existence, many figures from Stark's past flashed before his fading consciousness: companions, enemies, mere acquaintances who had briefly intersected with his lengthy existence. But these phantom images dissolved like mirages, leaving him alone in the endless desert of Hueco Mundo, just as he had always been. His expression, rather than showing fear or anger, revealed a strange sense of relief. The burden of consciousness was finally being lifted from his weary soul. The Espada were falling one by one, yet Aizen still made no move to intervene directly. The self-proclaimed god remained an observer to the destruction of his vaunted army, watching with apparent detachment as his most powerful warriors were systematically eliminated. For Stark, this final confirmation that his so-called companions had been nothing but illusions from beginning to end brought a bitter form of closure. Nothing had truly changed throughout his long existence. In the end, he remained alone, as he had always been. Loneliness was the most authentic and enduring aspect of his life, the one constant in an existence marked by change and loss. Under such circumstances, ending his life could indeed be considered a form of release, freedom from an existence defined by isolation despite being surrounded by others. Stark glanced at Uehara Shiroa, who stood calm and motionless before him, and mustered his last reserves of strength to speak. "You are stronger and calmer than Aizen. You are a truly strong person who never feels lonely. I really envy you." His voice faded into silence as his body began to disintegrate, transforming into spiritual particles that scattered on the wind. Uehara Shiroa watched this process without comment, his expression revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. Then, he noticed that his own body had begun to dissipate at the edges, spiritual particles breaking away from his form and dissolving into the atmosphere. He frowned slightly at this development. Is the time up already? After all that,
I still couldn't fully enjoy myself.
There was genuine disappointment in his tone, the frustration of a connoisseur whose meal had been interrupted before completion. Before his form could dissolve completely, he made one final gesture. With a casual wave of his right hand, his remaining Ryatsu burst outward in a controlled wave, instantly enveloping Matsumoto Ranjiku and performing what could only be described as a resurrection of sorts. In the next phase of this conflict, he knew that Aizen would begin eliminating targets indiscriminately, putting on a performance of power to inspire fear and cement his position. Removing Matsumoto Ranjiku from the battlefield represented Uehara Shirowa's final act of mercy in this engagement. As for the others who remained, they would simply have to accept whatever fate had in store for them. He had done what he could with the time and resources available to him. The spatial distortion created by his technique was so seamless that Matsumoto Ranjiku didn't immediately realize what had happened. One moment she stood on the battlefield, witnessing the clash of titanic powers, the next, she found herself in familiar surroundings far from the conflict.
Hey!
What? What happened? She exclaimed, looking around in confusion at the headquarters of the 10th Division. The transition had been so abrupt, so complete, that her mind struggled to process the change.
How did I suddenly come to the 10th Division headquarters? What happened?
Having completed this last intervention, Uehara Shirowa turned his attention to Haribel, the sole surviving member of the three Espada he had been facing. When his gaze swept over to her position, his body seemed to vanish instantaneously. In the next heartbeat, he materialized directly beside her, as if he had somehow traveled through both time and space rather than merely crossing the physical distance between them. Haribel's emerald green pupils contracted in shock, shrinking to pinpoints as her body tensed instinctively. Without hesitation or deliberation, she swung Tiburon to summon thousands of water droplets from the surrounding atmosphere. These rapidly coalesced into layers of water that formed an airtight barrier around her, a desperate attempt at self-preservation. Yet despite this protective measure, Haribel did not allow herself even a moment of relaxation. The Zanpakuto in her grip no longer provided the sense of security it once had. Her previously unshakable confidence in her abilities had begun to waver in the face of what she had witnessed. Even her hands, which had never trembled in countless battles against formidable foes, now shook slightly as they clutched Tiburon's hilt. Haribel's nervousness and unease were entirely understandable under the circumstances. The three strongest Espada had united their powers against a single enemy, yet two of them had already fallen, their immense power proving inadequate against Uehara Shirowa's overwhelming strength. When confronting such a terrifying adversary, anxiety was not merely normal, it was the only rational response. However, her caution, however prudent, ultimately proved futile against the force she faced. A flash of cold light rapidly expanded in her field of vision, growing from a distant glimmer to an all-encompassing radiance in less than a heartbeat. The energy coalesced into a perfect slash that seemed capable of penetrating anything in existence, from the most fragile flower petal to the hardest diamond. Time itself appeared to hesitate at this moment, as if the fundamental forces of the universe paused to witness the clash of powers. The formidable water barrier.
A defense strong enough to withstand even a captain's bankai suddenly crystallized and froze solid. An instant later, it shattered into countless fragments, transforming into thousands of raindrops that fell toward the earth below, nourishing the soil with spiritual energy. Under that terrifying slash, the defensive barrier she had so carefully constructed didn't even resist for a full second before it yielded completely. Haribel's emerald eyes flashed with determination as she recognized the direness of her situation. She released a primal roar from deep within her chest and swung Tiburon with all her remaining strength, attempting to intercept the incoming slash before it could reach her body. The collision generated powerful shock waves that expanded outward in concentric rings, forming a localized hurricane that obliterated everything in its path. The Ryatsu released in that single moment was enough to disintegrate nearby structures and disperse clouds in the sky above. The raindrops that had not yet completed their descent were caught in the sudden atmospheric disturbance, transforming back into vapor and being swept away by the fierce winds generated by the clash. Blood sprayed from multiple wounds across Haribel's body, staining her white uniform crimson. She recognized immediately that she had sustained serious injuries despite her best defensive efforts. In this critical moment, with her life hanging by the thinnest of threads, she utilized the very blood flowing from her wounds to power her strongest technique, the ultimate Zero available to an Arrancar who had released their Resurrection, Gran Rey Zero. Her final reserves of Ryatsu transformed into a terrifying golden energy that erupted from her position with devastating force. The brilliant beam shot outward with incredible velocity, momentarily illuminating the entire battlefield with its radiance. The golden flash barely managed to deflect the slashing wave of energy and the accompanying pressure of Ryatsu. Simultaneously, Harabel created a powerful stream of water that carried her rapidly away from her previous position, utilizing this final opportunity to escape from certain death. Chapter 239. At this moment, Uehara Shiroa's physical form and iceblade had already begun to dissipate like morning mist touched by sunlight. Luminous particles of spiritual energy broke away from his outline, drifting upward before fading entirely from view. The allocated time for the clone's existence had expired, its Ryatsu reserves completely depleted by the intensity of the battle. Harabel was extraordinarily fortunate to have escaped with her life. The Tres Espada had survived where her two companions had fallen, a remarkable outcome given the overwhelming disparity in power that had been displayed throughout the confrontation. Yet her survival had little to do with her own strength, formidable though it was. Her continued existence was permitted rather than earned, a result of Uehara Shiroa's mercy rather than any failure on his part to complete her elimination. In the final exchange, Uehara Shiroa had merely inflicted a casual wound upon her, deliberately avoiding her vital points despite having ample opportunity to target them. Had he directed his attack with lethal intent, Harabel's chances of survival would have been virtually non-existent, regardless of her considerable defensive capabilities. Before the clone vanished completely from the battlefield, Uehara Shiroa gazed down at Harabel with an expression of absolute authority. The look of one who held complete dominion over another's fate. His voice carried across the distance between them, clear and resonant despite the chaos of battle surrounding them. From today on, your life belongs to me, and no one else can take it away. The declaration was not merely a boast but a statement of ownership, a claim staked upon her very existence. In that moment, he had marked her, not as prey to be hunted, but as property to be preserved for his own purposes. So it was just a clone? Harabel's voice carried a bitter undertone as she processed this revelation, blood still flowing from her numerous wounds. Reflecting on the battle they had just survived, if such one-sided domination could even be called a battle, she felt a profound sense of desperation washing over her. The hopelessness of their situation became increasingly apparent with each passing moment. Now that she had time to consider what had transpired, she realized that they had never been fighting against a mere person at all. Their struggle had been more akin to challenging the fundamental forces of nature, attempting to resist the sky and earth themselves. No matter how valiantly they fought or what sacrifices they made, they could never have shaken such immutable powers. They had given everything they possessed, expending all their Ryatsu to unleash their most devastating techniques. By any reasonable standard, they had conducted themselves admirably, approaching the confrontation with appropriate caution and making no tactical errors that might have granted their opponent an unnecessary advantage. Yet despite their textbook execution, they had still faced inevitable defeat. This had not been a contest between equals or even between beings of comparable nature. It had been, in the truest sense, a battle between mortals and a god. Those who dared to raise their hands against divinity were invariably punished for their hubris, forced to endure the wrath of powers beyond their comprehension. The three Espada had learned this lesson at tremendous cost, Barragan and Stark with their lives, Harabel with her pride and autonomy. Although Uehara Shiroa's clone had dissipated from physical manifestation, his influence over the battlefield only expanded in the aftermath of the confrontation. His presence and the oppressive weight of his spiritual pressure seemed to linger in the atmosphere, growing stronger rather than fading with his physical departure. The other Shinigami present were utterly shocked by the display of power they had witnessed. Their worldview, built around certain assumptions about the hierarchy of strength, had been forcibly reconstructed in the span of a single engagement. Traditionally, captain-level Shinigami represented the pinnacle of the Gotei 13's military strength, figures who had rarely met their match in battle and whose authority remained largely unchallenged.
With the exception of the captains and vice-captains who had defected with Aizen, the Gotei 13 had not suffered the combat death of a captain in living memory. Yet facing the top 3 Espada, several of these supposedly invincible captains had found themselves at a severe disadvantage, confronting the very real possibility of defeat and death for the first time in their long careers.
This realization had plunged many Shinigami into a state of profound pessimism regarding the ultimate outcome of this war. Then, like a deus ex machina descending from the heavens, Uehara Shiroa had appeared on the battlefield. With seemingly casual ease, he had suppressed all 3 of the strongest Espada simultaneously, using what they now understood to be merely a clone rather than his actual self. He had moved among them like a god of war from ancient mythology, pursuing the 3 Espada and thoroughly defeating them in every aspect of combat. Speed, power, technique, tactical awareness, in each category, his superiority had been absolute and undeniable. The Shinigami's reaction to this display transcended mere surprise, entering the realm of existential shock. Uehara Shiroa's strength had proven to be beyond any rational metric they possessed for measuring combat capability. It existed in a realm so far beyond their expectations that they found themselves simultaneously awed, relieved, and terrified by what they had witnessed. This previously unknown magnitude of power, something that exceeded their collective imagination, stunned everyone present, from the newest unseated officer to the most experienced captain. Even Yamamoto himself appeared momentarily taken aback by the display, though his weathered features revealed little of his inner thoughts. Before this incident, they had understood in an abstract sense that Uehara Shiroa possessed exceptional strength. After all, he had previously demonstrated his terrifying Bankai and defeated several captains in direct combat. Many still vividly remembered the bone-chilling Ryatsu that had accompanied that demonstration. Since that day, however, Shiroa had never again revealed the full extent of his capabilities. They had never again witnessed him engaging in serious combat against worthy opponents. Consequently, the Shinigami had maintained a somewhat muted assessment of his abilities. Acknowledging that Captain Commander Uehara was certainly powerful, but perhaps not fully appreciating the true magnitude of that power. They hadn't anticipated that Shiroa could be so overwhelmingly strong that he could handily defeat 3 of the most powerful Espada using nothing more than a clone. The implications were staggering. If a mere fragment of his power could accomplish such feats, what might his true self be capable of? What manner of strength was this? Was it some new application of Bankai that they had never encountered before? Could this power possibly exceed even that of the Captain Commander himself? Even Kayaraka Shunsui, who had been feigning death while waiting for an opportune moment to launch a surprise attack, found himself deeply shocked and confused by what he had witnessed. His original strategy had been relatively straightforward. First, he would pretend to be incapacitated, then identify a crucial moment when he could assist Shiroa by attacking unexpectedly. If circumstances permitted, he hoped to eliminate one of the 3 Arrancar and thereby tip the balance of the confrontation. In Kayaraku's estimation, it would have been a remarkable achievement for Shiroa to merely hold his ground against 3 such powerful opponents simultaneously. He was intimately familiar with Stark's formidable capabilities, having faced the Primera Espada in direct combat. Adding 2 more Arrancar of comparable strength to the equation should have created an insurmountable challenge. The 3 Espada fighting in concert would have presented extreme difficulty even for Yamamoto Genryusai, possibly forcing the ancient Shinigami to unleash his Bankai. That Shiroa could face such opposition without his true body seemed beyond all reasonable expectation. Kayaraku had fully anticipated that his old friend would rapidly find himself overwhelmed, necessitating immediate support from any available ally. After all, facing a coordinated assault from 3 master-level opponents would generate immense pressure that few beings could withstand for long. In such desperate circumstances, Kayaraku had resolved to offer his assistance regardless of his own injuries. The bonds of friendship demanded nothing less than his full commitment, even at considerable personal risk. Reality, however, had thoroughly contradicted his expectations. Far from merely enduring against the 3 released Espada, Shiroa had methodically dismantled them, killing 2 outright and severely wounding the 3rd before his clone finally dissipated. This outcome had profoundly surprised Kayaraku, forcing him to reconsider his understanding of his old friend's capabilities. The talent Shiroha possessed was truly terrifying in its scope and potential. Kayaraku's previous assessment of Shiroha's strength had placed him roughly at the level of a particularly gifted thousand-year captain. He had assumed that while his friend was certainly stronger than the average captain, he remained somewhat below Yamamoto's level, with considerable distance still separating him from becoming the strongest Shinigami in existence. Kayaraku had maintained absolute faith in Shiroha's potential and natural talent but believed that realizing that potential would require substantial time and experience. In his estimation, Uehara Shiroha would eventually grow into the strongest Shinigami, but that eventuality lay in the future rather than the present. Chapter 240. But now it seemed that this assessment had been fundamentally flawed. Shiroha wasn't merely under the mountain or even level with the mountain in terms of power hierarchy. He had already ascended beyond such limitations, he was above the mountain. The metaphor of the mountain had long been used among Shinigami to describe the pinnacle of strength represented by Yamamoto Genryusai. To be under the mountain meant to be weaker than the captain commander, to be level with the mountain suggested equality with his tremendous power. But to be above the mountain, that implied a realm of strength that transcended even the ancient foundation of the Gotei 13. Brother Shiroha, have you grown to this point? That's truly magnificent. Kayaraku thought to himself, a mixture of pride and astonishment coloring his internal dialogue. Returning his attention to the immediate situation, Kayaraku shifted his gaze toward Aizen, Ikamaru Jin, and Tozen Kaname, the three architects of the current crisis. With the Espada effectively eliminated as a fighting force, these traitors represented the remaining threat that needed to be addressed. The Espada are finished. Next, it's these three culprits. It's time to clean up the traitors. His strategic assessment was concise and accurate, though he immediately recognized the primary complication they still faced. But we must be cautious of Kyoka Suigetsu's perfect hypnosis. Such a troublesome ability. Despite the challenges ahead, Kayaraku couldn't help but feel a touch of envy toward his old friend's apparent freedom. Sometimes I really envy Brother Shiroha, who can come and go as he pleases and act according to his own will. That's truly living. The other Shinigami present shared similar sentiments regarding their overall strategic position. From their perspective, the three traitors would inevitably face defeat now that their Arrancar forces had been eliminated. Their reasoning seemed sound, the Shinigami maintained numerical superiority, and the momentum of battle had shifted decisively in their favor. They had multiple captains to oppose a single Aizen, and most importantly, they had the strongest Shinigami, Captain Commander Yamamoto, leading their forces. How could we possibly lose under such favorable circumstances, they thought confidently. Arrogant Aizen, you understand nothing about the true power of the gods. While these assessments were being made, Tozen had activated his Resurrection, transforming into a hideous creature that bore little resemblance to his former self. He engaged in fierce combat with Kamamura Sajin, his longtime friend turned adversary. Both combatants appeared to be holding back somewhat, neither willing to immediately resort to their most devastating techniques. As a result, their battle had reached a temporary stalemate, with neither gaining a decisive advantage over the other. After witnessing Uehara Shiroha's clone disappear from the battlefield, Kamamura called out to his former friend. Fighting 1 against 3, and emerging unscathed, Commander Uehara's strength has grown even more formidable than before. It appears that what we witnessed was merely some form of clone ability rather than his true self. Kamamura's voice carried a mixture of awe and certainty as he continued, you cannot possibly defeat Commander Uehara. This war that you have initiated lacks any moral justification, and you have no realistic chance of victory. Tozen, surrender while you still can. Tozen, his appearance drastically altered by his transformation, seemed to struggle with controlling his emotional state. His response came in a tone that bordered on fanatical devotion. Uehara Shiroha is indeed a significant obstacle. He should have been eliminated much earlier in our planning. But it is not too late to address this issue now. Lord Aizen is truly invincible. He will certainly defeat Uehara Shiroha. The former captain of the 9th Division no longer resembled the stoic, reserved blind justice figure that his colleagues had known for centuries. He had abandoned not just his loyalty to the Gotei 13, but seemingly his very humanity as well.
Black wings with thin, membranous surfaces had erupted from his waist, while his entire body had become encased in black bone armor.
His hands and feet had mutated into something alien and predatory.
From a distance, he resembled nothing so much as an enormous, deformed insect, specifically, a grotesque fly of impossible proportions. His face had undergone the most disturbing transformation of all. Two massive, purple eyes now dominated his features, bulging, lidless orbs that seemed to drink in the visual information of the world with insatiable hunger. These enormous eyes occupied the majority of his facial structure, creating an appearance so unnerving and revolting that it threatened the sanity of those who beheld it too long. This monstrous form represented the power gained through embracing hatred rather than justice. Tozen had personally requested that Aizen use the Hogyoku to transform him, enabling him to attain complete holification and perfect integration of hollow powers. Through his resurrection, he had achieved completion. A state that compensated for what he had always considered his innate defect. For the first time in his existence, he could perceive the visual world directly. He could see. Throughout his life, Tozen had harbored resentment toward what he perceived as the fundamental injustice of fate. From birth, he believed that some divine force had cruelly deprived him of sight and, later, had taken the life of his dear friend Kakushika. In Tozen's mind, it was Aizen who had offered him a new beginning, granting him enhanced power, the possibility of vision, and the opportunity to pursue what he considered true justice. For these gifts, his loyalty to Aizen had become absolute and unquestioning. Therefore, the current Tozen Kaname maintained unshakable faith that justice would ultimately prevail, though his definition of justice had warped beyond recognition. Looking at the dramatically transformed figure before him, Kamamura felt a profound sense of sorrow overtake him. "Tozen, you can see now.
Is this why you betrayed our friendship? But at what terrible cost have you gained this ability? What has become of the justice you once believed in so passionately?"
In previous years, Kamamura had concealed his face behind a helmet resembling a wooden barrel, hiding his lupin features from the world. He had feared being viewed as a monster by his fellow Shinigami, believing his unusual appearance would make him an outcast. His friendship with Tozen had been particularly meaningful because the blind captain couldn't perceive his physical differences. Tozen had accepted him based on character rather than appearance. This had created a profound bond between them, one that transcended superficial judgment. Now Tozen could finally see Kamamura's wolf-like countenance, but ironically, the 7th Division captain no longer felt the need to hide his true nature. He had learned to accept himself fully, revealing his unique features openly to the world without shame or hesitation. The cruel irony was that while Kamamura had found self-acceptance, his dear friend had undergone a transformation that rendered him monstrous in both body and spirit. The corruption had penetrated beyond physical appearance, reaching into the very core of Tozen's being and warping the principles that had once defined him. This tragic reversal filled Kamamura with immense sadness, yet he recognized that his personal feelings couldn't alter their present reality. Fate indeed seemed to delight in creating such bitter ironies, twisting relationships into painful reflections of what they once had been. Tozen responded in a tone dripping with contempt, "I can indeed see now. I can clearly perceive your hideous appearance. It's no wonder you concealed your face before. I have already paid the necessary price for my vision. As for justice, do you truly believe that remaining loyal to an organization that protected my best friend's murderer constitutes justice?" The revelation of Tozen's motivations provided crucial context for his betrayal. As a member of the noble Tsunoyoshiro family, Tokunada had murdered Tozen's friend Kakushika but had escaped punishment due to his aristocratic status. The Gotei 13, bound by the social hierarchy of Seoul society, had been powerless or unwilling to bring the murderer to justice. In Tozen's view, an organization that would protect such a killer could never embody true justice. He would never acknowledge or accept such a perverse interpretation of moral principles. This fundamental disagreement illustrated how people with irreconcilably different ideological perspectives cannot effectively work together toward common goals. The gulf between their definitions of justice had become too vast to bridge through mere dialogue. After activating his Bankai, Kamamura swung his Zanpakuto with determined resolve and shouted, "Tozen, although I have no desire to take your life, I must stop you from causing further harm. I will defeat you and force you to recognize your errors. The massive spectral form of Kakujo Tengen Myo materialized behind him, mirroring his movements as he continued. Your eyes may now perceive the physical world, but they remain blind to essential truths. I will personally awaken your sense of justice. If you still refuse to change your path after facing defeat, I will have no choice but to cut you down with my own hands. Ridiculous! Tozen snarled in response, his newly acquired vision focusing on the enormous armored giant that served as Kamamura's Bankai. Without showing any sign of fear, he rushed directly toward the imposing figure of Kakujo Tengen Myo. What qualifications do you possess to pass judgment on me? My physical vision has indeed changed. I can clearly see your monstrous appearance now. Don't attempt to deceive me any longer with your hypocritical notions of justice. Despite the confidence conveyed by his words, Tozen exhibited subtle signs of anxiety in his movements and spiritual pressure. This underlying uncertainty influenced his tactical approach, causing him to choose the most aggressive and direct method of engagement possible. He seemed driven by an overwhelming urge to vent destructive impulses that had accumulated within him, to externalize the chaos that had taken root in his soul. The transformation of his body had been accompanied by a corresponding transformation of his psyche, leaving him struggling to maintain coherent thought patterns amid surges of primal emotion. The two former friends, now positioned on opposite sides of an unbridgeable ideological divide, faced each other with weapons drawn and resolved hearts. What had once been a relationship built on mutual respect and shared values had deteriorated into a life-or-death confrontation that only one could survive. Their battle represented not merely a physical contest but a clash of fundamentally incompatible worldviews, a philosophical argument given expression through violence rather than words. Each blow struck carried the weight of their respective convictions, each parry a rejection of the other's core beliefs. That wraps up this part of What If Transmigrated in Bleach World. Thanks so much for listening. As always, new parts drop every 4 days, so be sure to stay tuned. Also check out my Patreon channel for early releases of all the series, where you can find all the series released one day ahead of YouTube. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and please consider supporting the original author as well. See you in the next one.